My parents died suddenly when they were very young, and it was heartbreaking. I felt cheated. But if there was a silver lining to that tragedy, I told myself, it's that the chance of me becoming a caregiver for an ill, aging parent was zero. Ironically, 20 years later, what do I become? But an expert in aging and dementia. I work with people with Alzheimer's disease, and I counsel their caregivers. And when caregivers would tell me their stories about their anguish, their frustration, and their exhaustion, I would think to myself, well, maybe I am really the lucky one. For a long time, I felt guilty about that, because although I could totally be there for caregivers clinically, I really couldn't personally relate to their experiences. And then Marilyn got sick. Marilyn was someone who I befriended when I was in my 20s, who was a mentor to me. And her children were not equipped to take care of her. So I stepped up to the plate. Hey, who better than the expert, right? So I started to care for her. I found her assisted living. I found her doctors. I spoke with her caregivers. And I got her those little but important things like raised toilet seats. And I went to visit her to make sure that she was okay. But as time went on and she got worse, then I would wake up in the middle of the night worrying about her. And I became anxious and stressed out. I became utterly consumed by her situation. So I go to my therapist. Yeah, the therapist goes to her therapist. And I said to her, what is wrong with me? I should be able to handle this. And she looked at me and said, hello, you have caregiver stress. And it didn't dawn on me until that very moment that I had fallen down the rabbit hole. But I can tell you this, I never truly appreciated the enormity, the stress and weight of caregiving until I became one myself. Right now in the United States, there are 5.5 million people with Alzheimer's disease or another type of dementia. There are about 14 million people caring for those patients. And caregivers provide 18 billion, that's billion with a B, hours of unpaid care. What does unpaid mean? It means that people like you and I are doing the caregiving. That's spouses, partners, children, siblings, and yes, friends. And all those caregivers want to do is a good job in taking care of people. A caregiver is anyone who cares for another person and helps them, who's dependent upon them. And caregiving happens along a continuum, and anywhere along that continuum, it can be taxing and burdensome. So on the one end of the continuum, you have the people that are in the trenches of day-to-day caregiving. They live with the person, they provide face-to-face care like getting people in and out of bed and taking them to doctors and bathing and cooking. And they're there all hours of the day taking care of the patient. On the other end of the continuum, you have the folks that orchestrate the care, right? They find the doctors, they hire the caregivers, they manage the finances, and they get those calls at 3 a.m. when there's an emergency. And they all are trying to do the best job they can do. But one thing about caregiving, the good news is that most people can learn the skills they need to be good caregivers. But the not so good news is that once they become caregivers, people are lousy at taking care of themselves. And that's not good. That's because caregiving can make you sick. Being a caregiver can make you sick. In fact, it can kill you. And this applies to all types of caregivers, not just those caring for someone with Alzheimer's disease. Caregivers are at higher risk for things like heart attack, cancer, immune system dysfunction, and depression. And older caregivers, they're at increased risk for death. And some even die before their afflicted loved one does. So, learning to cope with the caregiver situation, learning caregiver self-care is essential. And I've studied this through research and through personal experience, and I can share 5 things with you to help you ease that journey of caregiving. And the way I remember them, and this might work for you, is as SUPR. S-U-P-R. The first S is sand. Don't stick your head in it. If you notice that your loved one is repeating himself over and over again, if your mother gets lost going to the grocery store or burns up pots on the stove, stop making excuses for them. And please don't do the denial thing. I had one client who would insist about her father, oh, he's okay, he's just old. But all the while, her beloved father is going downhill before her very eyes. And some caregivers become co-pilots for their loved one while driving because they can't bear to take that away from them. But that kind of denial can lead to an accident or even a tragedy. So, if you see that your loved one is doing something that surprises you, that concerns you, do something about it. You can Google their symptoms, go to the website of the Alzheimer's Association, and don't be afraid to talk to your loved one about your concerns. And go to the doctor with them for an evaluation. And this is important because we now know that early treatment of dementia can help reduce people's symptoms, it can slow the progression of disease, and help stave off your stress as a caregiver. The second S stands for support. Go to a support group. Caregiving is hard, and you can't do that by yourself. And caregivers will tell you, they'll tell you that their friends don't come around so much anymore. And they suffer, and they are isolated, and they have thoughts that make them uncomfortable, like, I wish my mom would die and this was all over with. And some people develop resentment towards the person they're caring for. And you'll feel awful when you have those feelings, but they do come up. And that's why you need to go to a support group. Because people in support groups have all been there. They understand those feelings. They feel those feelings. And they know that even though you feel awful for having them, that those thoughts are coming from a place of distress and sadness. U is for uplift. Every day you need to find a way to uplift yourself. When Marilyn was dying and I went to visit her, it was painful to see her in her condition. But I felt good about being her friend and acting towards her like a daughter. I was able to do for her what I had no opportunity to do for my own parents, and that was uplifting. And caregivers will tell you, even when their loved one is being cranky or difficult or demanding, they're still uplifted by the thought that they're caring for them, that they're performing an act of love, fulfilling a sense of duty, and making their life better. And caregivers have told me that their life is absolutely transformed by the experience, and some develop a more positive view of life. And when it's all over, they don't regret what they did. So on the days when your loved one has clarity, when they smile, when they're funny, even if they don't mean to be, and when they show you that glimmer of their old self, savor those moments and uplift yourself with those feelings, especially on the days when you want to quit. P is for personal, as in don't take things personally. Dementia is a brain disease, and it causes people to say things that are untrue, hurtful, paranoid, weird, things that they don't mean. I had a client whose wife accused him of cheating on her with her caregiver, and he was shocked by that. But when I was able to remind him that paranoid thoughts are part of Alzheimer's disease, he no longer took that personally. And sadly, for many of you, there will come a time when your loved one no longer recognizes you, and that will crush you. And on that day, you will need to remind yourself, don't take it personally. Finally, R. R is for respite. Find respite. For the people in the trenches of day-to-day caregiving, respite means completely getting away from the caregiver situation for at least 20 minutes a day. And this is non-negotiable. You can read a book, go for a walk, grab a cup of coffee, anything that makes you feel better. And caregivers, please give yourself permission to be helped. I know of a 90-year-old woman, and she was on the verge of physical and a mental, emotional collapse. She was the sole caregiver for her 95-year-old husband. And when she finally allowed herself to get a little help with housekeeping, she hired a professional for a few hours a day, she was able to cherish those last months of her husband's life. For all types of caregivers, there's another type of respite. It's mental respite. And I think of that as letting go of the small stuff. When loved ones first come to me to evaluate their loved ones, when the family members first come to me and they want me to evaluate their loved ones, I hear them quizzing them on things like, what did you have for dinner last night? What are the names of your grandchildren? And even though they mean well, they're maybe trying to bring them back into reality, or they're trying to exercise their memory. They're just reminding their loved ones of their problems, and they're making them feel worse. Now, my client's mother, who suffers from Alzheimer's disease, lost her husband of 62 years. And at each visit, she still asks, "Where's your father?" And my client, who has learned to let go, simply tells her, "He's gone fishing, Mom," which is something he really did like to do. So she doesn't correct her mom. And she doesn't remind her that her husband's been dead for 5 years. So find respite in your own way and learn to let go of the small stuff. It's liberating. Look, caregiving is hard. You're watching a loved one deteriorate. And I'm not going to pretend that these 5 ways of coping are totally going to eliminate your stress and your burden, but they will sustain you through your journey. They did for me when I was taking care of Marilyn. Now, I had a lot of knowledge, but I had to do so much more. I went to therapy to get support, and I learned to uplift myself, knowing that I was doing for her what I could never do for my parents. And that was a huge source of satisfaction to me then and to this very day. And when Marilyn lost the mental clarity to hold a conversation and talk on the phone, I had to remind myself not to take that personally. And I found respite in letting go of the idea that she was going to get better. If I can leave you with one thought, it's this: love them, but love yourself too. Support them, but support yourself too. And help them, but allow yourself to be helped also. Take care of yourself. Take super care of yourself. Thank you.